McLogan stood in front of the large painting, staring. His irises were of such a dark colour, they were almost indistinguishable from the pupils. His nose was severe, and his face was pale in the cold light of the gallery. His blue linen suit was so dark it was almost black, so he seemed devoid of colour. He smiled slightly, and the light falling on his hard-looking mouth gave it a very pale red. His sharp teeth were revealed a little, sharp and white like paper. It was an ugly painting that was mostly a bloody red with sharp finger-like bones that pointed out towards the viewer. They touched at the fingertips, giving the whole picture the appearance of two hands facing each other, but only barely touching, as if in a very pious prayer. Two black blobs that gave the impression of perfect spheres at the top half of the painting stared back at McLogan. Brian Murray was a curator in the gallery. It was a cold, austere 19th century building. It gave a cold northern light to the pictures, and it had really mysterious, chilly drafts that could hit you randomly from any angle. They made Murray think of darts being thrown at him. The only time he was ever bothered by these uncomfortable darts was when he saw the painting by the French artist Lacine. He hated Lacine's work, and he thought the one example they had of it was too many. McLogan, the director, told Murray he was expected to participate in a coming exhibition of Lacine's work to be staged in the gallery, and it would fall to Murray to deal with the visiting groups interested in it. Murray could feel himself internally dropping. "I know you hate his work, and I know you hate that picture, but it's out with my control," said McLogan. "You'll have to put aside personal feelings and be a real academic. I suggest you waste no more time and start boning up on him." Out with. What kind of a fucking word is that? And how dare that Scottish prick imply I'm not a real academic? He hated McLogan and his aggressive style of management. McLogan was very calm when faced with aggression from others. It gave him a superior, arrogant toughness that enraged Murray. Murray could scream at him and scream and scream, and McLogan wouldn't move a millimeter. McLogan's face just looked back at him calmly, disdainfully and archly. And then there was the smell. It wasn't quite that of rotting, but it was dry. He was sensitive to smell, yet he couldn't explain this. No one else in the museum commented on it. Sometimes he felt an overpowering urge to retch, but he always managed to stop himself and conceal it. After their exchange, the saturnine McLogan turned casually and seemed to glide away. He would have to bone up on Lacine and talk to boring people who obviously had no appreciation of art. His plan was to read up on some definitive works about Lacine and study the painting they had. At least he could sound like he knew what he was talking about. Then he could do a study of other paintings that would be on display, and then he was finished. Murray walked into the room with the painting and looked up. The ceiling was too high, the walls were too white, the doors were too tall, and the glass in the long, tall windows was too cold. The cold walls made the red in the picture look like it was bleeding. He stood in front of the painting and felt an involuntary spasm. He ran his gaze over it. He stood near it to examine the factures so he could see the brushstrokes. He could look at the direction of the paint and how much oil was used, but as he looked at the strokes, he noticed that some of them didn't have an obvious end. There were areas where lots of oil was obviously used, and he followed them with his eyes. They seemed to continue all over the painting. Sometimes streaks of red continued everywhere, and sometimes streaks of silvery metal. Sometimes it was a deep, dark black. Everything was arranged in front of a deep blue landscape, lit with blue light. As he looked, he seemed to go deeper into the black and deeper, as if he couldn't get to the end of a tunnel where the light was. He mumbled something. He vaguely felt himself being pulled up by his arms. There was a ringing in his ears. The sound was very loud. He began to shiver. His teeth chattered. He tried to speak but bit his tongue, tasting blood. He felt numb and stupid. Everything was happening in slow motion. The noise, an alarm. The silver of the blades in the painting seemed to be more prominent and stood back like stanchions that closed him in. They were passing him and coming behind him. The red occasionally came down and blurred his vision, but beyond the red blur was still the black eyes and the movement of the silver light. He looked up at the bright blueness and calmed himself. He was so calm, and he thought he would sleep. He thought of getting up, but put it off. He felt drained and sleepy. His eyes closed. There was a new noise. It was like a hiss, like a heavy sack being dragged through grass. He couldn't hear the alarm. The two black eyes stared down at him. He looked into them, but he didn't feel afraid at first. He was floating and relaxed. He wondered if he was dreaming. But then he didn't care. He looked at his body, and it was covered in a blue light that made it transparent, just like the blue in the painting. He lay back and looked at the deep blue sky. The melange of the strokes and the silver bone-like fingers were gone. He just saw the deep black pools that looked like eyes. They were staring. Was he alone? Is anybody there? He said. You are here. He heard the reply, but he didn't hear it. He felt discomfort at first, and this turned into panic. The communication didn't have a volume in the normal sense, but its effect was the same as loud. He wanted to move around, but there was nothing to move in. No substance. He wanted to move quickly and get away, but his arms and legs didn't respond. He could feel a thrill of panic internally pounding. After a few minutes of this inactivity, he became calmer. Nothing seemed to be happening. Did he speak? He wondered. No. Murray wondered how they were communicating. The same way everyone communicates. How's that, he thought. You think of a message and communicate it. How were you created? The same way everything is created. How's that? Why do you ask such a question when you already know the answer? No, I don't. Everything is created in someone's mind, then fashioned. Just like you are communicating with me. we're not speaking. Really? Murray thought of nothing. He had no reply. So how were you fashioned? You must know or realize how. Why do you feel so cold in here? Because I hate you. I know. And I hate this room. Because I am in it. And I take my sustenance in this room. But what are you? How do you live? My servant feeds me. Your servant? Colgan. Colgan? Or whatever he calls himself these days. He comes and looks at me every day. He makes sure I have suitably emotional sustenance. Like you, for example. Like me? Murray could feel a panic starting. Mortal man lives in such fear of loss, and death, and old age. Instead, a man should be bold and fearless, pass boldly into a new departure without morals, fear, and acceptance of primitive assumptions. A truly great man should follow his desires to the end and beyond. You have so much fear and emotion, it screams out so much life force. And beyond? What did he mean, life force? God like me, for example? He thought of the accounts of Lassim's attempts at capturing life force in his victims. Victims? The panic surged and pounded all over him. He had to escape. He desperately tried to move, but nothing responded. He couldn't thrash about or do anything. He could just look out. He tried to talk, but he wasn't even sure that his mouth was moving. He could still taste the blood in it. He could see the silver blades again lining up on either side of him. Then he saw the red blur again, but bigger. The movement was still happening, and he thought he had grown fangs. He decided this was nonsense and tried to get up. Still, nothing responded. His eyes opened, and the blades pressed closer and closer. He could feel something against the back of his head. A blade pushed through and cut through his tongue, pushing on with the point coming out of his mouth. All he could see was red, and he was screaming inside, but he had nothing to scream with. It continued with the sides of the blades opening his mouth wider, and then cutting into the sides, tearing the mouth bigger. As it cut into his cheeks, it stuck out of his mouth like a grotesque tongue. The blades surrounding him were now cutting his body to pieces from either side. The alarm was going off in the gallery. McLogan stood in front of the painting and turned it off. He turned to one of the guards. I think it's a false alarm. Just be vigilant. Someone might have tried to interfere with the painting. The guards moved on, leaving McLogan alone in front of the picture. McLogan stood in front of the painting, staring. He stared and stared with his dark irises and pupils. He stared with his pale face in the cold light. The cold light shining on it, and his sharp nose accentuated by shadows. He looked colourless, almost like a silhouette. He smiled slightly, with the light falling on his hard-looking mouth. His sharp teeth were revealed a little. A nice morning's work, he thought. Yes, it was. You did well, Colvin, I must say. It's the emotional ones who are best. Well, I tried to select them for you, Master. Did you have a hand in his emotional state? If so, you did well in this matter. Yes, Master. He was easy to upset. So much energy tied up in those people. Of course, there will need to be a replacement. Of course, Master. I have someone in mind, another sensitive academic. Someone else who will have to bone up on your work. It tends to create a suitable mindset. Am I so intimidating? Of course, it is strange how these people disappear. Colgan laughed internally. Emotional people tend to vanish, don't they? The exhibition will give us more opportunities, and you won't need so much assistance from me, Master, because there will be so many of them to choose from. You can gorge yourself. Just a bit of grooming for the emotional ones, you know what is required. You have served me well, Colgan. I promised you life. That is what we both have achieved. Yes, Master. You have given me so much. The new man to conduct the exhibition will be suitable when it finishes. It's a pity I can't have him now. I think you'll be happy with him. Anyway, there will be a lot of people at the exhibition. Variety is always good. And now for your reward. Thank you, Master. I'm so looking forward to this one. He was so deliciously vulnerable. MacLogan approached the painting with a small smile, revealing the points of his teeth. The red in the painting looked like it was running, and MacLogan put his bloodied hand up to his mouth. He leaned forward and drank, his eyes closed like a feeding child. There were noticeable specks floating in the cold light. They were tossing gently in the draughts, and the acrid smell that Murray couldn't describe was strong. When MacLogan was finished, he stepped back, staring. He smiled more broadly, revealing his pale gums and the extent of his very sharp teeth. But now there was blood on the tips, and his tongue was dark and soaked. He closed his mouth and wiped some drops from his lips and face. He reactivated the alarm and stepped back. He resumed staring with a slight smile. He had the effect of someone who was quietly happy.